Don't look at me. There was one time, about 5 years ago, when my mother complained about the doorbell in the morning. They called at night, between 2 and 3 o'clock, insistently demanding. Mom said that every time she was surprised that no one at home could hear them except her, and she would get up, go to the hallway and ask, without hurrying to open it, "Who is there?" And the answer to her every time was silence. We didn't have a peephole at that time. It was still made during the repair 2 years ago. So she listened carefully, thinking that she would hear footsteps or rustle behind the door. But in vain. They called again, and again they did not respond. And every time Mom didn't dare to open it, and went back to bed. In the morning, before leaving for work, she complained to me and my father that again someone came at night, persistently rang the doorbell, and did not respond. My father, by nature a skeptic and humorist, said that it was the conscience or the ghost of a salary increase that came to my mother from oblivion. Mom herself didn't dare to joke about it. I, just like my father, did not hear these strange calls, and I thought that my mother was seeing them through a dream. But this was repeated every week with enviable regularity. In the end, Mom just stopped coming, and the calls stopped at night. As it turned out, only for a while. Since last year, I began to suffer from insomnia. I could lie in the dark for hours, contemplating the ceiling, and listening to the clock ticking over my ear. Time on such nights drags on slowly, like molasses. Only when it begins to lighten outside the windows, the long-awaited dream comes, usually deaf and colorless. I did not try to take sleeping pills, and at night I was brewed herbal tea chamomile, mint or lime, but it was of little use. And the night, a time of rest and sleep, turned for me into a time of painful wakefulness. It happened on one of those sleepless nights. It was the beginning of February. The night was dead and moonless. Snow was falling outside the windows. I was alone in the apartment. Mother and father went to the godmother, but could not return, as the buses were canceled due to bad weather. I went to bed late, about an hour. I usually go to bed earlier, as couples go to the morning shift. But as soon as my head touched the pillow, I realized that I couldn't sleep again. I tossed and turned, wrapped myself in blankets and blankets, covered myself with a pillow, strenuously forcing myself to fall asleep. But all my attempts were unsuccessful. According to the old tradition, I had to lie on my back and lie still, thinking about everything in the world and waiting for the sky to begin to lighten, because sleep will come along with the first rays of dawn. When suddenly I shuddered from surprise, the doorbell rang, so shrill. Someone was pressing the bell button too hard, as if wanting to wake up the neighbors as well. I decided that my parents had returned, and immediately hurried to the front door, and already reached for the door lock, mechanically asking who is there. No one responded. I was wary. The call was repeated, and with the same insistence. Who's there? I'm asking. Answer me. In response, silence. I listened. There were no noises outside the door, complete silence. And then I felt terrible. I already had a chill. Another call. I tiptoe up and look through the peephole. The playground is illuminated by the bright light of two bulbs. I see a boy standing at the threshold, about 10 years old, in a simple fur coat, without a hat, in felt boots, mittens hanging from the sleeves on elastic bands. The hair is dark, the face is round, but without any expression. The eyes are large, colorless. It's snowing outside, but there's not a snowflake on it, and the clothes are dry. He raised his head and looks up, as if he knows that I'm looking at him. And then I realized that how did such a kid reach for the bell, and does not respond why? And where is he from? We don't have a single child of that age in our entrance hall. And from these thoughts, the horror shivered me to the very bones. I keep looking, and the boy suddenly curled his lips, and his face darkened in a moment. He opened his mouth and said, "Don't look at me." The voice is hoarse, raspy, like an old man's. "Don't look, otherwise it will be worse." I'll scream in horror as I recoil into the corridor. And they are already scratching at the door and hoarsely muttering, "I saw, beheld, and I, paralyzed with horror, stand and do not know what to do. And there everyone is scratching and wheezing. My God, I shout, protect me from the unclean. And I begin to baptize the door with a trembling hand. Help, Lord, save me from evil. And almost immediately the grinding stopped. Something wheezed, knocked on the door, and went quiet. And I draw all the signs of the cross with my hand. I stood there for another 10 minutes. I listened, silence. I didn't dare look through the peephole at the door. I returned to the room, turned on the light, and sat there until morning. Until I passed out from tension and fatigue. The parents returned by noon. They woke me up, complained about the bad weather for a long time, and asked what happened to the front door. They said there were scratches on it. We have it covered with dermatin. The layer was recently changed. The scratches are small, but noticeable, deep. I thought I'd faint when I saw them myself, but I didn't fall. I restrained myself. I haven't heard the doorbell ring since. Mom, too. And thank God. Someone or something has clearly accepted that he will not be opened, or was afraid that he was seen, or knocks on another door and God forbid, he will be opened. A lonely house on a half-stop. The events are real. They happened to me personally around 1998. I was 15 years old at the time, but I still remember the horror I experienced then. And I'll probably remember him for the rest of my life. At that time, we lived in a small 2-story house for 5 families, built next to a small railway station. In Soviet times, my parents worked as railway workers and they were settled in this house so that they could get closer to duty. The house was built before the war, miraculously preserved, and our apartment on the 2nd floor looked like a fortress, 3-meter ceilings, thick brick walls. In the early 90s, when times were turbulent and outright robberies often occurred on the railway, parents ordered and installed powerful iron doors and iron bars on the windows, which saved my life later. It was a late spring evening. It had been dark for a long time. My parents had gone to visit relatives in a neighboring city, but I had successfully excused myself by referring to lessons. I was lying all alone in my apartment, as it turned out later, in the whole house and watching something neutral on TV. And then there was a knock on the door. They did not call, although the bell was and worked, namely, they knocked. And the sound was like knocking, with a big wooden hammer or a huge fist. This sound in the middle of the night, to put it mildly, did not please me and did not bode well for me. To be honest, I was very scared. Not bandits, zombies or anything else specific, but just scared. Fear originated somewhere in the vertebrae of the neck, slid down the spine to the stomach. The hands did not obey, and the legs became wadded. It's hard to describe, but somehow I knew that I was finished. Absolutely accurate and without options. The banging on the door stopped. The horror loosened its grip a little and I was able to find the strength to go to the door and look through the peephole. What I saw there, I can't understand and realize to this day. There was a non-human standing outside the door. It was a creature bigger than any man I've ever seen. It was wrapped from head to toe in some kind of dark canvas raincoat, obviously not new and dusty. It was as if this cloak had been lying in the attic for 10 years. And then it was put on without bothering to brush off dust and cobwebs. On the head of the knocker was a huge hood part of the cloak, because of which the face was not visible. But I was sure that the visitor was looking right through the peephole and knew that I was looking at him. We stood and silently looked at the door, each from his own side. I was shivering slightly, and the creature in the canvas raincoat showed no signs of life. I didn't make a sound. I tried not to breathe. There were no thoughts in my head. There was no panic. There was just a feeling of overwhelming horror and hopelessness. The reason for this was not only the appearance of my guest, but also the way he breathed. A person cannot breathe like that. Neither drunk, nor out of breath after running, nor hiding, and he did not think to hide. A person is physically unable to breathe like that. And then the creature behind the door smoothly and jerkily raised its huge hand and slammed its fist into the same canvas glove as the raincoat on the armored door to my apartment. It moved like a drunken robot or a monster from a cheap computer toy, natural, but scary. It hit again and again. It seemed that he was absolutely not bothered by the fact that the door does not give in. He is ready to hammer it as much as necessary. I stood half a meter from the door and listened to the rhythmic knocks on the door. I was afraid. I was not afraid that the door would not hold. I was not afraid of death, but of the one who knocks on the door. I was afraid, not that it would kill me. I was scared that such a thing could even exist. Soon I was able to think again. At first I thought that the neighbors would hear and come to the rescue, because these blows could be heard all over the house, but then I remembered that the house began to be resettled, because it was subject to demolition and at the moment only two families lived here, ours and another, on the ground floor. Probably, they were not at home or they did not dare to go out. The second thought was to call. I even ran up and picked up the phone, but there were no rings. I only heard about mobile phones at that time and, of course, I didn't have one. The idea of jumping out of the window did not even occur to me then, because probably the instinct of self-preservation blocked even the idea that it was possible to leave a safe shelter and meet this infernal creature on the street. And the monster behind the door kept banging on the door with his fist. Monotonous, meaningless, and silent. I also didn't say a word, quietly returned and sat down on my bed. I listened to these beats and fell asleep a few hours later. It seems unreal and illogical, but the body, exhausted by the horror experienced, simply turned off. When I woke up, it was morning outside the window. No one else knocked on the door. But to go out to check and even look through the peephole, I hesitated for a long time. I lay and listened, but I couldn't hear anything except the noise of the railway outside the window. Then I gathered a little courage, tiptoed up to the phone. It was working. I immediately called my parents and asked them to come home as soon as possible. I tried to tell my parents honestly about what happened. They decided that it was just a healthy drunk bandit who came, who seemed too scary to me in the dark. I didn't argue, because I knew with my mind that I was saying real things and I would not have believed my own nonsense for anything if someone had told me this. The dents on the door indicated that I had not completely invented the story, and my parents were not too lazy to write a statement to the police about the robbery on the apartment. That was the end of it, at least. I've been hoping for many years that it's over. Door peephole. I have a bad habit of reading various scary stories on the internet at night, and from a mobile phone, lying in bed. One day, after reading all sorts of stories about ghosts and brownies, I heard some creaking in the hallway. There was no one at home that night. Those who know what it is, strange sounds in the apartment after reading horror stories or watching a horror movie, will understand me. But curiosity was stronger than fear. I got out of bed, tried to put out of my head all the fantasies that had already flashed through my brain, and went into the hallway to see what was there. Of course, I didn't see anything unusual there. Smiling to myself in the mirror that stood in the hallway, it was a trilogy cabinet with one main mirror and two rotating side mirrors. I went to the toilet to smoke. However, there I continued reading internet horror stories. Less than 2 minutes later, the creaking in the hallway was repeated again. I opened the toilet door and saw that one of the side mirrors of the trilogy had turned, and now I could see my reflection in it. That's when it got creepy for me. I flushed the half-smoked cigarette in the toilet and went out into the hallway, and immediately there was a short knock on the door. The third hour of the night. Who could have come? I went to the door, opened the peephole and looked into it. Someone's silhouette was standing behind the door. It was a silhouette that looked like a shadow, not a person. I instantly jumped away from the door, and suddenly someone began to hammer at it with such force that whitewash began to fall from the ceiling. The side mirrors of the trilogy began to clap on the main mirror, breaking into fragments. I turned around, the toilet door flew off its hinges, and I saw a man with a rope loop around his neck, suspended from the ceiling. I woke up. It turns out I just fell asleep with my phone in my hand. But the dream was so realistic that I still clearly remembered the silhouette of the man standing outside the door. Getting out of bed, I went to the kitchen to drink some water. Passing through the hallway, I looked at the peephole and was horrified. It was open. This is very unusual, since the peephole on the front door in our apartment closes itself if you do not hold it with your fingers. It became a little scary, but I still went to the door and looked through the peephole. There was no one at the door. I even exhaled with relief. Having returned the metal latch of the door peephole to its normal state, I went to the kitchen, drank some water and went to bed. And that would be the end of my story if, waking up the next day, I did not find that the peephole was open again. There was no one at home who could have done this. This system continued to work for almost 2 weeks. I told my family and friends about it. The relatives themselves were convinced of the truthfulness of my story, also starting to notice this oddity. Then everything seemed to settle down. I didn't even do anything. However, since then I have been trying to read all sorts of horrors at night as little as possible, especially when I am alone at home. And for some reason I became a little afraid of the mirror in the hallway.